Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is John Nemi, and I work in the College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse University. I want to welcome you to today's Arts and Sciences Alumni Academy. The College of Arts and Sciences offers these Zoom talks as a way of letting alumni know of the great research and scholarship happening at the college. Today, we are pleased to present All Literature is Ecological. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items to share. First, we ask everyone to mute their mics. This will ensure that everyone can hear our presenter, and we are recording this event and will be shared on the college's website for people to view after this evening. If you do not want your image recorded, please feel free to turn off your camera. Closed captioning services are provided for this event. At this time, please direct your attention to the chat for additional instructions on closed captions and a few other informational items. Right now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Michael Goode, who's a professor in the Department of English, having joined Syracuse University in 2003. He researches and teaches on Romantic British literature and culture, ecology, media studies, gender, and critical theory. In 2024, as the William P. Tully Distinguished Teacher Professor in Humanities, he founded the Art, Ecology, and Climate Project in partnership with Syracuse University Art Museum. Professor Goode received his bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton in 1993 and his MA and PhD in English from the University of Chicago. I know we're all excited to get to today's presentation. So with that, I'll turn this over to Professor Goode.
Thank you. And I will share my screen and launch a PowerPoint here. There we go. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A sort of after. I'm not going to introduce myself extensively just because you just heard an introduction, but one thing that this slide captures that's not there is some of the courses that I teach, which range over a variety of subjects. They're mainly focused on British literature in different ways. I also teach some of the classes that take students abroad over spring break in the context of a regular 15-week-long semester. The blanket pronouncement in this session's title that all literature is ecological is not necessarily something that's self-evident, and it may even sound counterintuitive. I mean, you might say, like, how could a novel like Jules Verne's A Child of the Cavern, not a well-known text, from 1877, which glorifies coal mining through positive depictions of it, be considered ecological, given what we now know about fossil fuels and given what Verne himself even knew about the toll that coal mining takes on miners' health. But this just highlights how this session is not titled All Literature is Ecologically Beneficial. I'm going to cross that out. I'm definitely not trying to say that all literature has ecologically positive effects. And I'm also not going to be trying to tell you that all literature is ecological in the same way. I'm also going to cross that out. Nor, for that matter, am I going to be trying to make the same kind of claim that the ecological philosopher Timothy Morton makes when he wrote a book a while back called All Art is Ecological. Morton ended up defining being ecological as caring for something beyond the human for no particular reason. And what he meant by that was like caring for something non-human without some kind of self-serving personal or political agenda. Really kind of, in fact, with so little sense of agenda that you don't even know why you care. But when Morton declares that all art is ecological, what he really meant was something more along the lines of all aesthetic experience is ecological, because his thinking was coming out of a philosophical tradition where the experience of beauty was understood as caring for something beyond yourself, something beyond you, something beyond your regular agendas. So beauty is more than just like approval. So I'm not going to put an X through this screen in the same way that I did on the previous ones, because I don't actually regard Morton as fully off base in some of these things. But I am going to make his words go away because I don't want it to create confusion about what I am saying. Morton's declaration that all art is ecological or that all aesthetic experience is ecological is really not at all what I mean when I declare that all literature is ecological. What I mean is a bit more simplistic, and it's what you see here, that any literary text can be interpreted ecologically and in that sense can make its reader more ecological by giving them a new occasion to think about the world ecologically. And so to say this is to encourage you not to think of ecology and the environment as like topics or subjects that only certain literary texts take up, but instead to really start regarding things like ecology as a frame or an approach that can be applied productively to any text. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to think about ecology as an approach? Well, here's a visual conceptualization of the topical model of thinking about the relationship of literature and ecology. And in this, you have a kind of Venn diagram where you study the overlap between ecological literature and literature by focusing really only on that subset of novels, poems, whatever, that clearly demonstrate that they're about the environment in some way. And that approach, that subset of text might include some of the kinds of ones that you see here, texts that clearly express an interest in or concern about human relationships to the natural or non-human world more blatantly than other literary texts do. And this kind of topical approach to ecology through literature tends to regard the texts that it privileges as sources of information, maybe even as models to embrace or critique of ecological awareness. Now, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that way of thinking about ecology and literature, and there's certainly nothing wrong with any of these texts. In fact, I teach quite a few of these texts that you just saw on the screen here, and love many of them. I taught Jasmine Ward's Salvage the Bones to my undergraduate reading the environment class just last week, and I taught a chapter from Robert Kimmerer's nonfiction collection Braiding Sweetgrass, along with some poems for John Clare just 2 days ago in my graduate course. But the alternative approach to thinking about literature and ecology, and the one that I'm going to be elaborating to you today, is really designed, again, to make your encounter with any piece of literature, or really any artwork in any medium, into an occasion for ecological awareness. And that's by elevating ecology to the status of a mode of inquiry or a way of thinking, much in the same way that something like feminism names it not a topic, but a framework for thinking about anything. So here's a visual representation of this kind of model. Feminism, for example, becomes a methodological approach that you can apply to any novel, any film, painting, philosophical treatise, political speech, whatever, from any time and place, simply by asking the question, sort of what kind of gender codes are involved in this text? What assumptions about gender, commentaries on gender are operative in it, whether or not the author was really aware of that. And likewise, you can develop what critics would call the post-colonial interpretation of any text, by asking the question of, sort of how does that text contribute or undermine in some way, in whatever minor capacity, ways of thinking and attitudes that historically fostered imperialism or colonialism or racism. In that exact same way, you can take an ecological approach to any literary text, or what's sometimes called an eco-critical approach to a text, by asking the question, sort of what did or does this text, or how does it affect how its audience thinks and reacts to non-human elements and beings, or how does it thinking about a text through a planetary lens as opposed to a national one change its significance, or how does thinking about how a text relates to the history of energy potentially change its significance? I'm going to get into more how we do this in a minute, but before going there, I want to make a quick plug for how essential it is to do this, how essential it is to make this kind of thinking routine. And I'm going to guess that if you're attending an Alumni Academy session on all literature, entitled All Literature is Ecological, my hunch is that you probably don't need convincing that global climate change is real, or that it's accelerating. You may not even need to be told that scientists generally agree that the 6th mass extinction event in the history of life on this planet is already well underway. And because of humanity's role in climate change, and because of radiation released into the atmosphere through nuclear testing and accidents through the years, there's literally no surface on the planet or organism anywhere on the planet that has not been, quote unquote, touched by humanity in some way. Another measure of human impact on world ecosystems is to look at the world animal population and how truly few wild animals there are even left. The vast majority of vertebrate animals on the planet by weight are humans and the livestock we raise. And in fact, if you're here, you probably also don't need me telling you that many people call the era that we live in the Anthropocene now. And it's a way of acknowledging that because of human agency, we've really actually entered a new era of geologic time. Scientists and critics will debate and the name exactly that they want to use for this and when it may have started, but there's fundamental agreement about them that this new geological epoch has started, and that this has become more urgent than ever to do things that might mitigate some of the worst directions in which the planet seems to be headed, ecologically speaking. Things aren't so great. So is starting to read all literature through an ecological lens going to solve climate change? No, it's not. Is it going to even, help with water pollution? Probably not. Is it going to make a difference if every single person on this call starts reading literature ecologically? Again, probably not. But that said, to address any kind of ecological and climatological problem effectively really depends not just on good science and good policy, but fundamentally on cultural will. And it's ultimately widespread culture change that gives urgency to policy change, to lifestyle change. And that's what's needed, and especially for those changes to happen, but for people to stick with them. And so that kind of culture change really can be helped along, I think, by changing ways that people read, specifically by making ecology a key framework that they use when they read or interpret anything or everything. So what does reading ecologically look like in practice? For the rest of this talk, I'm going to be kind of laying out how we can approach or interpret any text as ecological through three complementary, if fundamentally different lenses: through what that literary text represents, through its material footprint, and through its kind of formal and medial interface with a reader. And the first sense in which we can interpret any literary text through an ecological frame is likely going to seem the most straightforward and familiar. And it entails focusing on how every literary text represents, comments on, attends to ways that culture is necessarily entangled with and contingent upon non-human things, ways that texts acknowledge how cultures are existing within ecosystems on many different scales at once. To focus on representation does overlap with the kind of topical approach to literature and ecology that I mentioned earlier. For it's the easiest to do this sort of analysis with texts that are clearly trying to represent or comment on the environment in some way, comment on the non-human world. For example, it's really blatantly obvious to any reader of Charles Dickens's 1854 novel Hard Times that the novel's about the factory system in England and its effects. And so that makes it really easy to ask a question of that novel, such as something along the lines of, like, how does it depict these things? How does it depict coal-powered factories and their effects on humanity, on land, on water? How can we put it in dialogue with other representations of industrialism's ecological impacts from the same time and place, such as this painting by Dickens's contemporary, William Wilde? Or we could take a novel like Deb Unferth's Barn 8 from a few years ago. It's about industrial chicken farming and animal activism in the 21st century. And it's easy enough to ask in this novel, well, how does this novel represent these things and to what end? And maybe how do these representations compare to Unferth's earlier journalism and what that made of industrial chicken farming? Or just one quick more example. Kate Beaton wrote a graphic novel in 2022 called Ducks, which talks about her experience working for 2 years in the Canadian tar sands. And how her novel, we could ask, comments on the ecological effects of that particular sector of the oil industry in that place, like how it comments on the tar sands entanglement with local residents, with Canadian working class migration, indigenous land rights, climate change, all of these things. We could ask how the visuals of this text sort of matter to thinking about its ecological commentaries and how they compare, say, to Beaton's fellow Canadian, Edward Bertinsky, who does art photography of the tar sands, which some people have kind of criticized over time, actually, for almost like aestheticizing ecological devastation. But I want to make this more complicated. So, kind of analyzing a literary text's interpretation, how a literary text representations might have ecological impacts really extends beyond what the text knows it's representing or what the author knew they were representing. It's important, too, to consider the ecological significance of things that come up more in passing in a text. So less as the text's clear subjects or targets than as kind of thoughtless details or things the writer took for granted. So to take an example, when someone says the words Sherlock Holmes or even Sherlock Holmes's London, my guess is that horses are not necessarily the first things that leap to your mind. But the ability to detect crime in Sherlock Holmes fictions, especially his early ones, or Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes fictions, especially his early ones, frequently depend on horse-drawn hansom cabs being readily available for hire for Holmes and Watson. And so the Sherlock Holmes stories not only habituate readers to the kind of presence of tens of thousands of horses in 1890s London, but they also make that presence feel necessary to the reader to deliver the affective pleasures that the plot ends up delivering. Like the horses, the plot becomes almost dependent on those horses. And this has ecological consequences beyond the text. For example, the seeming necessity of those horses to the reader can distract the reader from some other things about horses in 1890s London that never ever come up in Sherlock Holmes short stories, such as how much waste those horses generated in real life, waste that was contributing to the spread of various kinds of disease in the city at different points, or the frequency with which those horses were really overworked, fatally involved in accidents and that kind of thing. So one message of Sherlock Holmes stories may be that crime doesn't pay, but another unconsciously is to sort of bury the cost for public health and for the well-being of the animals themselves of making that crime not pay. From the perspective of what's called the energy humanities, in which you put focus specifically on kind of when and where energy gets represented in a text and how that shapes the reader's relationship to specific energy sources and uses, you could also point out here that horses are energy. They're a really key power source in the late Victorian era. So when Sherlock Holmes stories emphasize that justice might hinge on being able to hail a horse-drawn cab quickly, the stories are also to some extent grooming their readers to desire faster, more powerful replacements for horses, namely, eventually, the internal combustion engine, as it powers automobiles, whose power to this day we still measure in terms of horses, 50 horsepower, 100 horsepower. By the time Conan Doyle stopped writing Sherlock Holmes stories, London had gone from looking like the kind of place that you see here to looking closer to something like what you see here. And don't get me wrong, I am not trying to claim that Sherlock Holmes stories caused the rise of automobiles. That would be, again, a kind of an absurd claim. But what I am saying is that fictions can and do sense Stokes' sense of necessity around certain kinds of energy forms that can have cultural effects. And especially can have major cultural effects when that desire gets vectored kind of in the direction of energy from more powerful sources that for centuries have trended in the direction usually of non-renewable fossil fuels. And I think you can say this is especially true of a lot of action films and thrillers and crime films and so forth. So often films like these are unconsciously almost stoking the idea that the difference between getting away with something and getting caught hinges crucially on having a faster vehicle or a better vehicle than the other side, with no one really ever raising any real questions about kind of fuel economy or the potential exhaustion of fossil fuel supplies or greenhouse gas emissions and those kinds of things. That would really kind of get in the way of the plot. And I'm not trying to claim that it's bad to enjoy a good chase sequence or a good action film or something along those lines. I really love the crop duster scene in North by Northwest. But my point is really simply from an energy humanities standpoint, these kinds of scenes can really subtly deepen our sense of dependency on non-renewable fossil fuels. And some kind of energy always shows up in a text somewhere, even if it's just a campfire. And energy humanities encourages you to think about that and think about how that text somehow shapes your sense of need or critique around that particular kind of energy use. Something academics have been devoting more attention to in recent years, for obvious reasons, is how climate history shows up representationally in literature. And a famous example in my field, which is British Romantic literature, again, is Lord Byron's short narrative poem Darkness from 1816. Now, Darkness is an early work of speculative fiction that, like any speculative fiction, contemplates the question, what if X were to happen? So in this case, that question's, what would happen if the sun were suddenly extinguished? The poem starts, I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished. Now, for years, Byron's poetic dream about humanity kind of going off the rails when that happens, when there's no natural light, everything goes awry because they can't grow food anymore and humanity becomes extinct in the context of this poem. For years when reading this poem, critics took it as a kind of takedown of the Enlightenment because the poem sort of shows how base, cruel, and selfish humanity is at heart when essentially one of the basic conditions of existence are taken away. But then the critic Jonathan Bate pointed out a few years back that Byron wrote this poem in 1816. And when he did so, it was in the midst of a time called the Year Without a Summer. And it was called that because of a powerful volcanic eruption in Indonesia that no one in Europe ever really knew anything about at the time. It was the eruption of Mount Tambora, which is the largest known volcanic eruption in human history. There were virtually no sunny days across all of Northern Europe in 1816 because of all of the ash in the atmosphere, hence the Year Without a Summer. And in fact, all of that ash produced 3 years without summers throughout most of Northern Europe. 3 consecutive disastrous growing seasons. Crops failed on catastrophic scales, and hundreds of thousands of people starved to death. Hundreds of thousands. So here's a case where critics' failure to pay attention for decades to things like climate when studying literature meant that they'd essentially overlooked how the idea that the sun might someday stop fostering might all of a sudden kind of go out and stop fostering life may have actually felt less like a speculative conceit in 1816 than an actual kind of niggling worry, given a sudden and unexplained change in seasonal weather that was affecting its author, among other people. It was a dream that was not truly all a dream, just like the start of Byron's poem says. And through the lens of 1816's climatic conditions, the poem actually reads more like a probing of civilizations and humanity's contingency on climate. In that sense, you can think of darkness almost as the first work of cli-fi, which is the name for the genre really popular today, in which an author imagines the horrors that climate change kind of has in store for the world in the future. It's usually a dystopian fiction form. A similar reappraisal to what I've just described with Byron's poem Darkness has been happening actually with Northern European and especially British landscape paintings from these same years, from 1816 to 1818. When you review them retrospectively through what we know about Mount Tambora's disruption of weather, they start to seem documentary in ways that they previously hadn't. With Tambora in mind, it becomes harder to see the yellow skies that so often inhabit paintings of this time period as like a stylistic fad, and the potentially documentary quality of these paintings with respect to air quality is something that might resonate with you today in the present if you happen to live anywhere where in recent years you've experienced wildfire smoke directly from afar. The second way in which we can approach all literature as ecological is conceptually pretty easy to grasp, but in practice, it's a way that people don't often approach literature and art. And this is to acknowledge that literary texts are material objects in worlds of other materials, and thus that literary texts all carry ecological footprints. That is a very strange way of thinking about literature. Let me give you an example of how this can matter, but I'm going to do so first with a photograph rather than with a literary text. I'm going to get back to literature after this. So here's a photograph that's in the Syracuse University Art Museum's collection. And if we think about it merely in terms of what it represents or shows, sense one in which we can think about a text's ecological significance, we might characterize this photograph as a documentary record of an open-air butcher shop in 1920s Paris. But its significance changes when we register that it's a gelatin silver print. Now, there's nothing unusual about it being a gelatin silver print. This was the dominant photographic development process throughout the entire 20th century. And that process involved using a negative to print a photograph onto paper that's been coated in photosensitive silver salt that's suspended in gelatin. But gelatin, as you may know, is produced commercially by boiling animal bones and by boiling other waste from slaughterhouses. And so paying attention to the materiality of this photograph allows you to make the case that the photo is actually also representing some of the raw materials of which it's composed. Now, it's an open question as to whether the photographer is actually trying to make that connection, trying to comment on or acknowledge the link between what the photo represents and some of the materials out of which it's made. But it does bear mentioning that the explosion of commercial photography between 1890 and 1930 created such a massive demand for gelatin that it contributed to the industrialization of slaughterhouses in this time period. Eastman Kodak Corporation out of Rochester was using so much gelatin in the 1920s that it actually took over a slaughterhouse and glue factory complex in Massachusetts, and they converted it entirely to gelatin manufacturing just to keep the supply chain of gelatin stable. And so this consolidation of the slaughterhouse industry, which was already happening in the 1920s, also started to put many independent butchers out of business, like the kind whose stall is depicted in this particular photograph. It's happened all over the place in the United States and in France, places where photography was really popular. So if you look at this photograph through that lens, through the lens of the history of industrial slaughter of livestock, you can argue that it's a photograph, perhaps, of the kind of commercial establishment the photography itself was helping to render obsolete because of the raw materials of which photos were made. You can have a similar conversation about the ecological footprint of a novel, a poem, a manuscript by virtue of its material entanglements with the world. And so literary texts often do not call attention to this. They don't call attention to the raw materials or to the energy infrastructures used to distribute them. And that absence is something that can itself be analyzed and whose meanings are going to maybe change over time. But the materiality of literary texts is also present sometimes in the texts too, however indirectly. So take the rag pickers, for example, who show up on the peripheries of a lot of 19th century British and American novels as emblems of industrious poverty. These figures show up quite a lot, again, in the beginning of the 19th century, but basically, one of the things to think about here is that paper manufacturing prior to 1843 was primarily done out of cotton. And so what rag pickers were doing was usually picking up rags so that they could sell them to the cotton pulping industry to create the paper on which literature was printed. This after 1843 is when they sort of shifted over to wood pulp, at which point in time it entangled the literature industry more broadly with deforestation. One example I like to use to show how the materiality of a text can matter to understanding it is the first poem in the collection Songs of Innocence by the late 18th century British poet William Blake. Now, Blake's poems are really fascinating material objects in themselves. Blake was a printer who invented his own printing method, and that printing method involved copper plates, acid, and acid-resistant resin that he would use together to kind of print copies of his poems, and then he would hand paint every copy of his poem, thereby making every single copy of every poem visually unique. His production method thus kind of resisted mass production techniques to the point where he barely sold any and barely printed any because they were so laborious and expensive to print. And so the ecological footprint of any given Blake poem was really minuscule, at least in Blake's lifetime. The poem I want us to focus on, though, which comes from his best-selling book of poems, of which he only ever printed about 25 copies, one of which Syracuse is lucky enough to own. Let me read the poem to you quickly. This poem is one that focuses actually on the materiality of literary media. So, piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped with merry cheer. Piper, pipe that song again. So I piped, he wept to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed. And I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs, every child may joy to hear. I highlight this particular poem because representationally, it's in part about the material ecological footprint of art. The poem narrates how a tuneless, wordless, non-referential musical improvisation gets reworked by audience request into an instrumental song about a lamb, and then into a song about a lamb that has lyrics, and then into a song whose tune and lyrics have become codified enough that they can be repeated, played again, as it says in the song, moving it even further away from improvisation, and then into something stored in print, in writing, thus enabling its potentially widespread dissemination and repetition, something that every child may joy to hear. Now, how do the different materialities of the artistic media through which this song passes differ ecologically from one another? Well, I mean, for one thing, as this tune moves across media, its ecological footprint grows. At the start, the only material involved with the song is whatever the piper's pipe is made of, plus the breath blowing through it. And though the pipe may be material, that material can be reused endlessly to create new songs. That's what an instrument is. It's not a single-use object. But by the end of the poem, the kind of codification of this previously nearly immaterial, tuneless, wordless song as a written down song has given that song a more substantial material footprint through the ink and paper that store it or record it. And this ink and paper feels like it's a manuscript headed towards mass production too, insofar as there's the desire expressed, again, that every child may hear it. And this was, again, just to remind you, a far cry from Blake's own production methods, which resisted mass production for this particular poem itself. When thinking about how Blake's poem comments on art's material ecological footprint, it's also worth keying in on these lines, and I plucked a hollow reed, and I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear. The third line here kind of figuratively associates the act of writing with pollution. It either associates it with it as a contributor to it, if you read the rural pen as staining previously clear water, or maybe as a corrective, if you read the line as suggesting that the pain stains clarity into something previously murky, which metaphorically is actually kind of what some kind of writings achieve. Language is either clear or it's not. You could characterize communicating clearly through ink as deploying stain to create clarity. But in addition to the paper's and ink's materiality in the poem, Blake enters his songwriter's implement into our ecological notice too. It's a quote unquote rural pen made from a quote unquote hollow reed. A rural pen. What would an urban pen have been in 1789 when this poem was written? What would it have been plucked from? Well, the answer, of course, is a quill. Something not made from a renewable and non-sentient plant like a reed, but from the largest feathers on a goose, a swan, or a turkey. And it's at this point that we start to realize that Blake may not only be dissociating his own printed books from the greater ecological footprint of mass-produced ones, which in Blake's day, as it is still the case in our own, often don't sell out their entire press run, and then the remainder need to be sort of pulped or recycled. But also calling out writers generally for participating in animal cruelty. Because it would only be half joking to refer to the quill-making industry as big feather by the end of the 18th century. When Blake was writing in 1789 about the option to write songs with a plucked hollow reed, between 4 to 5 million geese, swans, and turkeys were being plucked annually to keep up with the demand for writing implements just in Great Britain. And that massive demand for feathers wasn't met by slaughter, but instead by live plucking 4 to 12 of a goose's, swan's, or turkey's largest and most physiologically embedded feathers. And the process was bloody, and it was quite obviously painful to the birds. The birds were then kept alive so that then their smallest feathers could be live plucked for down pillows multiple times a year until their bigger feathers had grown back, after which time the annual plucking cycle would kind of begin again. So certain people living in 18th century Britain at the end of the 18th century were beginning to regard this as cruelty. And parliamentary activism in the 1790s tried to prohibit live plucking, but the power of big feather was such that a bill prohibiting it didn't pass for another 40 years until the 1830s, by which time it was essentially a moot piece of legislation because the steel nib pen had just been invented. So it's important when thinking about the ecological significance of literature that we don't focus so much on the bales of cotton produced and later on the forests of trees felled to make paper, that we miss its massive historical entanglement with the poultry industry too. And Blake reminds us of this in his very media-centric poem, a poem notably not produced with a quill pen, and a poem that has a variety of birds sort of flying around in the poem's margins and its illustrations as well. And mind you, this is the same poet who would go on just a few years later to write a more radical poem about animal rights, such as a poem like his 1794, The Fly, which equates flies and human beings as living beings. The third sense in which I want to encourage you to kind of think about how all literature is ecological is the hardest to explain, and this is to think about medium. Every literary text medially interfaces with the reader as the text also mediates whatever it's representing. And that's a really confusing statement, I know, because I just used versions of the word media twice. And so I'm going to try to make it a tiny bit more concrete. Let's take the example of Charles Dickens's novel Hard Times from earlier. The novel represents Victorian industrialization and its social and ecological effects, and these representations take place medially through language. Hard Times is not a painting. Through narrative, it's a narrative text. It's not a non-narrative medium of representation. And that narrative takes place through narration. Narratives get kind of mediated through some kind of point of view, which can shift. Though in the case of Hard Times, it's often an all-seeing, omniscient narrator. And in addition to these things, that feel like they're in between the reader maybe and what's being represented, there are other medial layers too. There's the language narrating this narrative about industrialization is printed, unless somebody happens to read the novel to you, in which case it's voiced. And those printed or voiced words when the novel was first published would have arrived in small weekly doses, a few chapters at a time, because the novel was published serially, as you can see here. It came out in a weekly publication. But then early readers who waited for that serial run to finish and might then receive those printed words instead through the medium of the codex, that is a book with covers on it, the medium in which most of us now read novels, except when we're reading them through the medium of digitized print on an e-reader. I could not find an e-reader that had hard times on the cover, so I got one with at least another Dickens text on it. These are the kinds of things in which we might kind of think about in terms of trying to think about how the text medially interfaces with us. To think ecologically is fundamentally to think in terms of dynamic systems of relations and entanglements, such that anything that you think about, whether it's a person or place or a thing, is less a discrete entity than something that's really defined by its relationality with everything else. Everything, if you're an ecological thinker, whether that thing's a situation, a rock, or a living person, is really a system state defined in part by its materials and defined in part by how it's positioned within a set of complex and ever-changing relationships with other things. To consider a literary text in terms of medium is to think about the ways in which a text medially addresses and interfaces with you in ways that affect your positionality or relationality to other things in the world. And thinking in those terms is already really to be thinking ecologically, which is, in fact, so much so that when media scholars talk about the dynamics of how different media and media technologies interact with one another and relate to one another through their end users, they refer to it as media ecology. Thinking about media ecology is thinking about how, when new media come into a system or taken out of a system, does it sort of like change our positionality within that system, change how we maybe relate to other components of the world in which we live in. All of the media technologies with which you come into contact, all literary texts, are mediating things to you through whatever technology. In the case of literature, whether it's being read aloud to, reading silently from a book with pages, reading silently from an e-reader that has virtual pages to flip, reading silently on a computer screen on the internet where you're scrolling down almost like a giant papyrus roll. All of these things affect your interface with the literary text and whatever it's representing in ways that are also subtly affecting your own sense of relationality to and positionality to the world in some way. And if the text that you're reading is one that like Blake's poem that we were just talking about, also calls attention to its own status as a medium within a broader media ecology filled with other artistic media that are interfacing with their users in other ways, then thinking about the medial interface of literary text with its reader gets even more complicated. And that was a lot, and I realize it may have felt a bit abstract. And so in the time that remains, I want to try to make it more concrete by giving two final examples of this kind of approach to interpreting the ecological significance of a literary text. The first example is a shorter one, and it's the difference between how these two poems, which despite having plenty in common medially, nevertheless put their readers in different ecological positions because of differences in how they address their readers. So on the top, on the left, are the opening lines of the British poet Anna Letitia Barbauld's A Mouse's Petition, which was written back in 1773. And on the right at the bottom are the opening lines of the American poet Camille Dungy's Characteristics of Life from 2012. Let's first acknowledge how much they medially have in common. Both of them are printed, both of them have first-person speakers, and both of these first-person speakers are advocating to a human listener for the lives of small animals. But the speaker speaking in Barbauld's poem is a mouse. It's a mouse who's making a really rational and emotional plea to a scientist to spare its life, a scientist who's not you. The poem was written actually by Barbauld and addressed to her friend, Dr. Priestley, who used to kill mice when doing scientific experiments on gases. Priestley's the person who actually discovered oxygen. In contrast, the speaker of Dungy's poem is clearly a human who's opted to speak for the snail to you. Barbauld's strategic decision to have a mouse speak through a human voice, which is a voice that actually becomes your voice if you read the poem aloud, as people often did in the 1770s, that affects your ecological relationship to non-human things. Even if you know that mice don't talk, and you know too that if they could, they probably wouldn't talk like this one does, the poem nevertheless has kind of put you immediately, the reader, in the position of wanting to access the mouse's consciousness and to see just how important life might be to it, and how much that consciousness and how much that mouse's voice might actually overlap with yours if you could do so. And that medial position arguably encourages you to feel a sense of moral obligation directly to that non-human creature, your being or feeling in its place. In contrast, though, like Dungy's poem kind of denies you even the illusion of gaining that kind of medial access to the mind of a non-human creature, in this case, a snail. It informs you instead that your access is going to be through a human delegate, one who never actually claims to know the mind of that snail, but has opted to speak on its behalf. And so here your ecological obligation to the non-human feels more like an obligation to be civil to another human being. For it's kind of rude to stop listening if a fellow human being is speaking to you, especially if they're speaking to you in some kind of advocacy role. And in fact, the poem actually helps ensure that you feel this obligation to listen respectfully by medially positioning you as a reader, like as if you've asked for this whole act of snail advocacy in the first place. The first line of the poem sort of hovers almost uneasily between sounding like a command to you, like, ask me if I speak for the snail, and a response to your command or request for the speaker's thoughts. Ask me if I speak for a snail. And when the speaker says that they do speak for the snail, you kind of have to listen as an act of courtesy because it kind of feels like you've asked for this. So in other words, the medial interface of Dungy's poem really puts the reader in a different relation to a small non-human creature than Barbauld's poem does. Not just because the creatures themselves are different, mice and snails are different, but because the poem frames your sense of obligation to the non-human as something to do for another human, where Barbauld's frames it as more something the non-human asks directly of you, maybe even asks you in your own voice, again, if you read it aloud. Here's a second example, and I'm going to introduce this one in the form of a question. How might ecosystems and stories be different or more pointedly, insofar as one of the expectations of a novel is that it tells some kind of story? Are novels as a medium actually kind of bad at ecology? Like, do novels inhibit certain kinds of ecological thought? Don't get me wrong, I am a literature professor. I love novels, and I also acknowledge the political necessity for environmental activism of telling a good story. It was definitely the power of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring to tell a good story and an accessible story back in 1962 that made that nonfiction book so effective politically at ending the use of DDT. And I think there's some really amazing novels out there for teaching ecology. Just to give a quick plug, I think Richard Powers' Overstory falls into that category. But one fundamental problem that the novel form poses is that if ecological thought involves thinking in terms of the dynamics of systems and thus less in terms of beginnings and endings than more in terms of how everything is simply a system state, then it has to be said that most novels are actually really bad at helping you think this way. And they're really bad at it in part because they're so wrapped up with individual human characters and not really with the complexities of ecosystems. You really recognize this if you start to read a novel like Tom Comita's The Nature Book, which mashes together lines about the non-human world, about plants, animals, seasons, weathers, from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other novels. And the total absence of humans in this novel starts to drive home just how human-focused novels are. And to the same degree, the mashup also drives home in its narrative coherence, just how static and cliched references to the natural world often are in novels. And this is actually why my very favorite text for teaching ecological thought is Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, published in 1814, which is a strange choice, I think, probably for most people. It's my very favorite novel for teaching ecological thought because readers often hate it, and especially those who think that before reading it, they're going to love it because they love other Jane Austen novels. But the key is here is like why many readers don't like this novel. And it's because they're so conditioned by reading novels and maybe by watching narrative films too, that novels are supposed to do certain things that they sometimes find Mansfield Park frustrating because it keeps avoiding doing those things that novels are supposed to do. And why it keeps avoiding doing them, I would argue, is because it treats the place at the center of the novel, the large country estate of Mansfield Park, as its main character. And that main character is really best described as a complex ecosystem whose dynamics have been disrupted by the introduction of an outside irritant in it. An irritant who's actually the novel's main character, at least according to the regular conventions of a novel. In this case, it's a young woman named Fanny Price. When you approach Mansfield Park through this lens, instead of with your normal expectations for a novel, it gets really interesting. You realize that it's really a novel about the complexity of an open ecosystem, and in turn about the fact that ecosystems are not narratives. And that really kind of turns the whole notion of the novel's plot inside out, because the novel definitely has a plot, but its narrative unfolds not unlike or not like the realization of some kind of determined outcome that a system faced with this particular irritation might produce, an outcome about which you could then maybe moralize by saying, well, if you do this, then it's probably going to cause this good or bad thing. Instead, the novel unfolds as the story that it does, the story that it's realizing, kind of as if it's realizing only one possible system state that this ecosystem could produce in the face of this particular irritant. And in fact, Mansfield Park reminds its readers repeatedly in its ending and its closing chapters that things could have gone really differently in this novel if any number of small things hadn't chanced to happen. And you see a few examples of these reminders here. And I would say, moreover, the novel's very end even starts to make it start the whole process over again by producing a kind of narrative reset, by having a new ecological irritant show up and get introduced in Mansfield Park exactly as Fanny Price had been years before, only this time it's her sister Susan Price. Will Mansfield Park's ecosystem kind of behave the same way the next time around if this novel were to continue? It's really easy, in other words, to imagine something like Mansfield Park 2, which is maybe why there's no coincidence that actually one of the first ever published pieces of Jane Austen fan fiction was called Mansfield Revisited and did pretty much exactly what I just said. I say that this makes Mansfield Park one of the most ecologically fascinating novels out there because it's also theorizing this idea of the novel as an ecological medium through the way in which, to go back to sense one of how all texts are ecological, it is also representing and commenting on the popularity of large-scale landscape gardening projects, which were all the rage among Britain's landed classes in Jane Austen's day. And in fact, Mansfield Park name drops the period's most famous landscape gardener, Humphrey Repton, 6 different times in the novel. So yes, Mansfield Park does seem to want to comment politically on who and what benefits and gets harmed by aesthetic taste for large-scale landscape gardening that Austen knew firsthand had been kind of transforming the British landscape for decades. But the novel's also theorizing itself as a medium through the medium of landscape gardening. For what landscape gardening is essentially a systemic collaboration of human beings with plants, animals, weather, climate. And how it turns out on a given day or even over a given period of time is not just because of intentional design, but also unintentional consequences, chance, the kind of unequal agencies of the different agents within this system. Repton, the guy whose name drop she dropped, created the first ever before and after images ever used in design. And they were intended to help his clients visualize how the place that they already knew around them could potentially become so many different places. How, in other words, like how any given ecosystem could become many other things, has so many potential system states and different relations of things existing as potentials within it, depending on how you manipulate it, depending on what new elements you introduce or subtract from the system. Using the media lens of a garden to think conceptually about systemic relations and dynamics between humans and non-humans can be helpful, and using the lens of a novel about gardening that also takes its medial inspiration from gardening can lead us to ask some really probing questions about the challenge that narrative poses to the project of representing systemic things on broader scales, including climate. Like, what good can narrative be potentially in the context of representing things that are fundamentally non-narrative? That kind of conversation can make us all better critical thinkers about other kinds of representations of ecology as well. So, quick sum, all literature can be read ecologically through how it represents the world, through the ecological footprint of animals, or of its materials, and through the medial interface that it creates with its readers. And I think if you start reading in these different ways, no, it's not going to solve global warming, but doing so can be part of, again, the kind of culture change that perhaps could help. Thanks a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screens and sort of turn things over to questioning or comments or reactions.
Thank you so much, Mike. This is the second time I have had the pleasure of listening to Professor Goode in the last week, and each time I feel myself getting drawn into the artwork that he posts. But the presentation was fantastic as well. As he mentioned, we're ready for questions, so you can either raise your hand on your screen, your digital hand on the screen, or you could post in the chat, and we will get to you. Let's see. Okay, well, I have a question. When Mike and I spoke before we got on about technology and how we're adjusting to this technology in the academic world, given that it's moving so quickly. But how has technology shaped the way environment and literature are
Well, I mean, there's the obvious ways in which, as more and more literature is shifting out of actual physical form and its delivery format is becoming in electronic forms, you can think of all of the ways in which electronics are entangled with the environment, both through the power that's used to produce them, but then also the waste that's produced. I mean, you can have a book sitting on your shelf for hundreds and hundreds of years, but your computer device is only good for a few years before you end up sort of bricking it and kind of creating e-waste with it. And so there's that kind of change is definitely like sort of enmeshed with literature more generally. I would also say that there's that said on the more sort of positive side with some of the things that different kinds of electronic media are capable of. People are inventing new literary forms sometimes through that, because you can create literary forms where the text itself is sort of networked through some kind of set of websites or something like that. I think a number of some of the more important ecological thinkers out there have experimented with new forms of publishing that involve creating websites that are really, really interactive. I think one of the most interesting ones that I know out there is this site called Feral Atlas that's produced through Stanford University Press. The main driver behind it is a woman named Anna Lowenhaupt Singh, who wrote a book called The Mushroom at the End of the World that some people might know. And it's fascinating in terms of like how it tries to give you a non-linear path through the website so that you are really exploring and coming to terms with the different kinds of interconnection that are in the world that it's commenting upon.
Sounds like you're almost going to dovetail into your talk on AI there when you talk about the new forms of digital literature. Do you want to share with the group what you're working on when it comes to AI? Not exactly.
Yeah, sure. I've been thinking recently about what AI can't do well, and things that AI can do well. For example, like you can give it a text and ask it to summarize it or write a report on it. You can have AI kind of crunch numbers and things, very, very well. It can write computer code really, really well. It can pass a lot of tests, like any tests that involves a lot of decision trees. So AI has passed the bar at a really high level, and AI has passed the MCAT at a really high level. What it's really terrible at is actually interpreting things that it hasn't seen before. So a lot of the kinds of interpretation actually that existed in this presentation just now were, for example, going back to the Blake text and really kind of thinking about how some of those different components and material references and media references in that text interact with one another to say something is something that AI can't do especially well. And so I think it's interesting to think about AI that way in relation to literature. Thinking about AI specifically as it shows up in literature, I would point people. I kind of give a plug for a novel that came out this past year by Debbie Urbanski, who's an MFA graduate from Syracuse University. The novel made a big splash. I think it was published by Simon and Schuster. It was a big publication. It was called Afterworld. And in that novel, the premise of the novel, which you get on the very first page of the novel, so it's not a spoiler, is that humanity is already extinct because AI has figured out how to solve climate change. And then the novel sort of proceeds from there. So that's another kind of way in which kind of literature, AI, and ecology in this case are interwoven. I think I
Sorry, I
saw a
was,
question in the I think I saw a question in the chat there about
yeah.
applying this to non-Western literary works, works from other cultures. And I end up pulling a lot of my examples in this talk from the time because of my own expertise in British Romantic literature. I end up pulling a lot of the examples from my talk from that kind of time period in the late 18th and the early 19th century. But the fundamentally, I think something that I didn't touch on very much in this talk, or really only in passing, is that a lot of literature and a lot of framework for thinking about literature and generally at present is thinking through the lens of environmental justice too. So not just where environmental harms actually show up and occur in a novel, but thinking about how the responsibility for some of those harms is differentiated across different cultures, different nations, different people, and thinking more importantly in some ways about how the harms are differentiated so that different people experience different kinds of harm. Climate change is a good example of that. It's the industrialized nations of the world that are largely responsible for it, whereas the people who are experiencing its effects firsthand in the shortest term are often the kind of impoverished people in island nations where the sea levels are rising quickly. And islands that in many cases were exploited by colonial enterprises and mining and agricultural imperialism and other things. And so that certainly is a really important lens in general for thinking about other kinds of literary texts that are dealing with other parts of the world, and then other literary texts that are actually produced from other parts of the world as well. I do in something like my Reading the Environment class teach texts from other cultures, not just to make points about environmental justice, but also to look at, in some cases, how the ecological sensibility of something like basho haiku in centuries ago in Japan are quite different from the kind of almost like pastoral imagination that you get in certain British literary texts that seem to overlap in some ways with those haiku. So there's certainly, I think you can apply some of the same techniques I'm just describing actually to any literary text. They're just going to look different potentially based on the text and the culture from which it's from.
There's another comment in the chat, and we could open this up for a quick discussion if we have time, which we have a few minutes. Have you ever read the newest Louise Penny novel, Grey Wolf? It's a mystery, but the focus is water supply and her primary character, an inspector in the Sûreté, lives in a small town named Three Pines, which are almost in additional, excuse me. Three Pines, which are almost an additional character in her novels. It seems to me to be overtly ecological, masquerading as mystery.
So no, I haven't read that. Although it's from the formulation of it in the question, it sounds like a text that maybe I should take a look at. I think this attention. Obviously, people have thought about setting in literature for forever. Like something we all learn as one of the earliest things to pay attention to in literature, and thinking about setting as a kind of character. But I think that the sort of ecological sensibility of a novel really shifts when it feels as if that particular character is almost something whose potentials are being unlocked or unpacked, whose capabilities are being discovered through the ways in which people interact with that setting and its different kind of material components is something actually that is becoming kind of new, I think, in literary study. But thank you for the recommendation. I'll have to take a look at it. And I know Grey Wolf Press is the same press, I believe, that published Barn 8 that I brought up earlier in the slideshow, the book about industrial chicken farming.
And we actually do have one question. I'll let Wes ask his question. I'll unmute you, Wes. There you go. And then I think this will be the final one because we are just past 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Go ahead, Wes.
Thanks for that. I thought this was an excellent presentation, really exciting. The question I had is really to get your feedback on how are the students responding to what is clearly a very heavy responsibility as a reader to look at the material from an ecological standpoint. If the reader is not particularly adept or broad-minded or broad in their thinking and analysis, much of this will go right past them as either irrelevant or meaningless, and they may even find difficulty in executing it. But I think it's critically necessary because I do believe, as you referenced earlier, this would set a context for people would be more responsible in a variety of policymaking endeavors, and also in moving politicians and industrialists to be more responsible in their ecological choices. But I'm just curious how the students are embracing this responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of my own teaching has moved in more ecological and my own research has moved more in ecological directions in relatively recent years. And I noticed that when I put the word environment, which I sort of been resisting here, I used ecology more than environment, but when I put the word environment in a course title, I often get kind of a bumper crop of students that want to take that class, and I get a bumper crop of students from different majors. Like it's a different mixture of majors than I will often see. And so I think there's a clear desire on the part of students to want to study literature and the environment. I think when most students show up in a course like that, they think that it's going to be almost like the first model that I pointed to, the one where the syllabus is going to be populated by texts that are almost kind of like the greatest hits of texts that are kind of commenting on the environment. And I've never actually attempted to teach a course where my syllabus had nothing overtly or explicitly, ecological on it, and then ask the students to try to have a whole semester like that. But I found actually that they're really responsive to it. And I think they're really responsive to it because of the urgency. Certainly, I think the younger generation of students coming into college is much more aware that since birth of coming into a world that they've thought of as having various kinds of existential threats to it because of climate change. And I think that sense of urgency, if they signed up for the course in the first place, it certainly helps with that. As I said in my talk, this kind of thing in this particular session or in one given class is not going to have a huge impact. But in terms of the scale of the sorts of problems that we're talking about, it may have a big impact on individuals. But I do think that the more that we can build ecological modes of reading anything into many, many different kinds of disciplines, ecological ways of thinking into many, many different kinds of intellectual pursuits, that will help enact the kinds of climate or help enact the kinds of culture change that are necessary with a problem like climate change.
Thanks for the question, Wes. With that being said, Professor Goode, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really enjoyed the discussion, at least I know I did. Thank you all for joining us. This is our final Alumni Academy of the fall semester, but we will be back with more talks in 2025. Yep, we're almost there. So stay tuned for more invitations to future presentations, and we hope to see you all again. Have a great evening and happy Thanksgiving, everyone.